At a glittering charity gala in his own mansion, billionaire Reginald Vance mocks his housekeeper, Odessa Marsh, for touching his priceless antique piano to fix a sticking key, humiliating her in front of his wealthy guests. Rewind plus emotional backstory. We go back to Odessa's small apartment, revealing she was once a gifted concert pianist and piano technician before family tragedy forced her into domestic work, and she still keeps her late mother's tuning fork as a memory of the life she left behind. Rich/public setting build. The Vance Mansion's grand music room is introduced in full detail. A rare imported piano, crystal chandeliers, and a crowd of wealthy donors gathered for a classical music charity gala. First humiliation layer. Odessa quietly notices the piano is out of tune before the gala's feature performance and tries to warn a staff member, but Reginald dismisses and belittles her when she's caught adjusting the keys herself. Repeated injustice/system pattern. Flashback beats reveal Reginald has a pattern of treating household staff cruelly, taking credit for their work, and dismissing anyone he considers beneath him. Second good character/silent witness. The mansion's longtime butler, Walter, quietly reveals he has watched Odessa's hidden talent for years and hints that people far more important than Reginald already know who she really is. Villain crosses the line. When the gala's hired performer fails to arrive, Reginald publicly humiliates Odessa further, mocking her in front of the entire crowd and ordering her back to the kitchen just as the piano problem threatens to ruin his event. Hidden proof/evidence stacking. We learn Odessa was once a rising star at a prestigious conservatory decades earlier, and that her mentor, a piano technician to major recording artists, had once been secretly in contact with her, waiting for the right moment to bring her back. Authority entry/power walk. 3 legendary musicians attending the gala as guests of honor recognize Odessa's touch on the piano and rise from their seats in stunned silence. Big reveal plus proof scene. The music legends reveal that Odessa was once a celebrated prodigy whose career was cut short by tragedy, and that her piano tuning and playing technique is unmistakable to anyone who truly understands the instrument, backed by old recordings and conservatory records. Villain collapse plus justice. Reginald's arrogance collapses publicly as the very donors he sought to impress turn against him. His charity gala unravels, and his reputation crumbles in front of the people whose respect he wanted most. Aftermath plus emotional ending plus CTA. Months later, Odessa returns to the stage with the support of the music legends who found her. A foundation is created in her name to support overlooked artists, and the story closes with an emotional message and YouTube call to action. Get your hands off my piano before you break something you could never afford to replace. The room fell into stunned quiet. Crystal glasses paused halfway to lips. A string quartet in the corner stopped tuning their instruments, bows frozen midair. In the center of the Vance Mansion's grand music room, beneath chandeliers that cost more than most houses, a black woman in a simple gray housekeeping uniform stood beside a gleaming antique grand piano, her fingers still resting lightly on the keys. Her name was Odessa Marsh. She was 51 years old, and she had worked in this house for 3 years, cleaning floors that reflected like mirrors and dusting shelves lined with awards that meant nothing to the man who displayed them. "I only meant to fix the sticking key, Mr. Vance," she said quietly, lifting her hand away from the keys as if they had burned her. "It would have thrown off the performance tonight." Reginald Vance laughed, a short, sharp sound meant for the crowd more than for her. He turned to his guests, a room full of donors in tailored suits and diamond earrings, gathered for his annual classical music charity gala, and gestured toward Odessa like she was a punchline. "She thinks she's a piano technician now," he said, and a few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the room, the kind of laughter people offer when they're more afraid of billionaires' disapproval than they are uncomfortable with cruelty. "Sweetheart, that piano is a 140-year-old imported Bosendorfer. It doesn't need a maid's opinion. It needs an expert." Odessa didn't argue. She simply stepped back, smoothed the front of her uniform, and folded her hands in front of her the way she had learned to do a long time ago, in a life very different from this one. A calm, practiced stillness that came from years of swallowing words she knew wouldn't be heard. "Of course, sir," she said softly. "I apologize." She turned to walk back toward the kitchen, her shoes silent against the marble floor, her face composed even as something old and painful flickered behind her eyes. They had no idea who they had just humiliated. 2 weeks earlier, in a modest one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on the far side of town, Odessa Marsh sat at the small upright piano crammed into her living room, playing so softly the neighbors could barely hear it through the thin walls. She played every night after her shift at the Vance mansion ended, always with the same quiet ritual. The lamp dimmed low, a small silver tuning fork resting on top of the piano, beside a framed photograph of her mother, Eleanor Marsh, a woman who had once tuned pianos for touring orchestras before passing that same rare gift down to her only daughter. Odessa had been a prodigy once. At 19, she had been accepted into one of the country's most prestigious conservatories, her fingers capable of finding the exact imperfection in a chord that most trained ears would miss entirely. Her mentor at the time, an old master piano technician named Julius Okafor, had once told her that she didn't just play piano, she listened to it, the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. Then her mother had gotten sick. Then her younger brother had needed care no one else in the family could afford to give. Then the conservatory scholarship had quietly lapsed while Odessa worked double shifts to keep her family afloat. And somewhere in the space of 18 months, the rising young pianist the newspapers had once called a voice ahead of her years simply disappeared into ordinary life, replaced by a woman who cleaned other people's houses to survive. She had kept her mother's tuning fork all these years, carrying it in her uniform pocket most days without even realizing it, the way some people carry a rosary or a photograph. It was the only thing left of the life she had once imagined for herself. Tonight, before the gala, she had heard the piano's middle C sticking faintly under her own careful touch while dusting the room, and something old and instinctive in her had simply reached out to fix it, the way her mother once taught her, without thinking, without permission, without any idea of the humiliation waiting for her on the other side of that decision. She kept a small notebook, too, tucked in a drawer beneath the piano, filled with fragments of pieces she used to compose before life demanded she set that dream aside, melodies she still hummed sometimes while scrubbing floors that weren't her own, never quite letting go of the sound that had once defined her. She had no idea, closing her apartment door behind her that morning, that in a few short hours, 3 of the most respected musicians in the country would be standing in that very room, listening. The Vance Mansion's grand music room had been designed, quite literally, to remind visitors of their place in the world. Marble floors stretched beneath towering windows draped in heavy velvet curtains. A crystal chandelier the size of a small car hung above a 140-year-old imported grand piano, its dark wood polished to a mirror shine, positioned like a throne at the center of the room. Reginald Vance hosted this charity gala every year, inviting the city's wealthiest donors, arts patrons, and, this year, in a particular point of pride for him, 3 legendary musicians who had agreed to attend as honored guests. A celebrated concert pianist named Vivian Cross, a Grammy-winning jazz composer named Thelonious Reed, and a retired symphony conductor named Margaret Hollowell, each of them icons in their respective corners of the classical and jazz world. The event raised money for music education programs in underserved schools, though most of the guests that evening seemed far more interested in being photographed near the piano than in the children the foundation claimed to support. Waitstaff moved silently through the crowd with trays of champagne. A string quartet played softly near the entrance. Everyone wore the practiced smile of people accustomed to being seen. Reginald moved through his own gala like a man collecting compliments, shaking hands, laughing loudly at his own jokes, occasionally glancing toward the piano with the proud, proprietary look of a man who believed that owning something beautiful made him beautiful by extension. It was into this room, gleaming and self-important, that Odessa Marsh had walked quietly an hour before the guests arrived, carrying a dust cloth and a tray of polish, doing the invisible work that made rooms like this one look effortless. She had no idea how badly this particular piano was about to need her, or how loudly the silence in this glittering room was about to break. The sticking key had bothered Odessa the moment she noticed it. Middle C, catching faintly under pressure, the kind of flaw an untrained ear would never register, but that would ruin the evening's featured performance the moment a professional pianist's fingers found it mid-piece. She had tried, first, to mention it quietly to the event coordinator, a harried young woman named Priya, who was juggling floral arrangements and seating charts. "Excuse me," Odessa had said gently. "I think the piano may need a small adjustment before tonight." Priya had barely glanced at her. "The piano was tuned last week, ma'am. I really don't have time right now." Odessa had hesitated, glancing toward the instrument, torn between the part of her that had learned, over 3 long years, to stay quiet and small in this house, and the part of her that simply couldn't stand the thought of a beautiful instrument being allowed to fail in front of an audience that deserved better. In the end, it was the second part that won. She had approached the piano alone, pressed the sticking key gently, listened with the same trained ear her mother had given her decades earlier, and reached inside to adjust a single loosened hammer mechanism. A small, precise fix that took less than 90 seconds and would have gone entirely unnoticed had Reginald Vance not walked into the room at that exact moment. "Get your hands off my piano before you break something you could never afford to replace," he had said, and the humiliation that followed had unfolded exactly as it had that evening, in front of the gathering crowd. What Reginald didn't notice, what almost no one in that room noticed, was that near the far wall, an elderly black man in a perfectly tailored butler's uniform had gone very still, watching Odessa's hands with an expression that wasn't surprise at all. It was recognition. That small detail, a butler's quiet stillness in a room full of laughter, would become the first crack in Reginald Vance's entire evening. This was not the first time Reginald Vance had humiliated someone he considered beneath him, and it would not have been the last had the right people not finally been standing in the room to witness it. 2 years earlier, a landscaper named Isaiah Brooks had redesigned the mansion's entire garden using a rare irrigation technique he'd developed himself, saving Reginald nearly $40,000 a year in water costs. When a local business magazine ran a feature on the estate's innovative, sustainable landscaping, Reginald had taken full credit in the interview, never once mentioning Isaiah's name, and had let the man go 3 months later during a routine staff reduction. 8 months before that, a housekeeper named Marisol Vega had reported to Reginald's estate manager that a guest at one of his private dinners had made inappropriate comments toward her. The complaint was quietly filed away, no investigation opened, and Marisol was reassigned to the estate's smallest guest house, effectively removed from Reginald's sight line for the remainder of her employment. And just 5 months ago, Reginald's driver, a soft-spoken man named Terrence, had been publicly berated in front of the mansion's entire waitstaff for a 15-minute delay caused by construction traffic that had been completely outside his control. Reginald had docked his pay for the inconvenience and never apologized. None of these incidents had ever reached beyond the estate's walls. Household staff rarely had the standing, the evidence, or the platform to challenge a man whose wealth insulated him from almost every consequence that touched ordinary people. A house doesn't announce when its owner has stopped seeing the people who keep it running. It simply keeps functioning quietly until someone with enough standing finally happens to be watching. Each of them had left the estate believing their silence was simply the price of the paycheck, unaware that the same pattern had played out with a dozen others before them, quietly absorbed into the rhythm of a house that valued appearances far more than the people who maintained them. Odessa Marsh, standing near the piano with her hands folded and her composure carefully intact, was about to become exactly that kind of witness's reason to finally speak. Walter Higgins had served as the Vance family's head butler for nearly 22 years. He had watched 3 generations of wealth move through this house, had learned long ago exactly how far he could push back against cruelty before it cost him everything, and exactly how much quiet dignity he could preserve for the staff around him within those narrow limits. But he had also, over the past 3 years, watched Odessa Marsh in a way that had nothing to do with her duties as a housekeeper. He found her once, late at night, playing the piano in the empty music room after everyone else had gone to bed, her fingers moving across the keys with a fluency and emotional depth that Walter, who had personally hosted some of the world's greatest musicians in this very room, recognized instantly as extraordinary. He never told Reginald what he'd witnessed. He simply began, quietly, watching for the right moment. During the brief chaos following Odessa's humiliation, Walter approached her near the kitchen doorway, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Ms. Marsh," he said gently, "I need you to stay close to the music room tonight. Don't disappear into the kitchen just yet." Odessa looked at him, surprised, her eyes still glistening faintly from the embarrassment she was working hard to hide. "Walter, I really don't think. I've heard you play," he said simply. "Late at night, when you thought no one was listening. I've worked in this house a long time, Ms. Marsh, and I know real talent when it walks quietly past me carrying a mop." He glanced toward the three distinguished guests seated near the piano, deep in conversation. "You need to understand something. This isn't the first time this house has overlooked something extraordinary standing right in front of it." He didn't know it yet, but in less than an hour, one of the most respected pianists in the country was going to hear Odessa's touch on that piano and recognize it instantly. And Walter's quiet years of watching were about to matter more than he ever imagined. The evening's disaster arrived exactly 40 minutes before the feature performance was scheduled to begin. The hired concert pianist, a young rising talent Reginald had spent months courting for the gala, called to say his flight had been canceled due to a mechanical delay and he would not make it in time. Reginald's carefully orchestrated evening, the one meant to impress three legendary musicians in a room full of wealthy donors, suddenly had no performance at all. Panic moved through Reginald's face for exactly 3 seconds before he masked it with forced composure, snapping his fingers toward his event coordinator. "Fix this," he said. "I don't care how. This gala does not fail in front of these people." It was in the middle of this scramble that Reginald noticed Odessa still standing near the piano, quietly waiting at Walter's request, and something ugly flickered behind his frustration. "You," he said, striding toward her, his voice sharp enough to cut through the murmur of concerned guests. "Since you seem to think you understand this piano so well, maybe you'd like to explain to my guests why my feature performance just collapsed. Get back to the kitchen before you embarrass me any further tonight." The room went quiet again, this time with a heavier discomfort than before. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Vivian Cross, the celebrated concert pianist seated near the front, set down her champagne glass slowly, watching the scene with an expression that had shifted from polite disinterest to something far more focused. Odessa didn't move toward the kitchen. She simply looked at the piano, then at Reginald, and said, quietly but clearly enough for the front rows to hear, "I could play something, if it would help." Reginald laughed, loud and dismissive, waving a hand toward her uniform as if it were answer enough. This is a professional gala, not a talent show for the help. But he had no idea that Vivian Cross was already rising slowly from her seat, her eyes fixed on Odessa with an intensity the room hadn't seen from her all evening. He had no idea that the call was already, in every sense that mattered, about to be made. What Reginald Vance did not know, what almost no one in that gleaming music room knew, was that Walter Higgins had spent the last hour quietly reaching out to an old contact of his own, Julius Okafor, the retired conservatory mentor who had once trained Odessa Marsh, now living 2 states away, but still deeply connected to the small, close-knit world of elite classical musicians. Walter had explained, in a brief and careful phone call, exactly what he had witnessed over the past 3 years. A housekeeper who played, late at night, with a skill that seemed impossible to have come from nowhere. Julius, upon hearing the name Odessa Marsh, had gone completely silent on the line before finally saying, "I've been looking for that girl for almost 20 years. Julius had explained what Walter hadn't known, that Odessa Marsh had once been one of the most promising young pianists his conservatory had ever produced, until she vanished from the program without explanation, her scholarship quietly lapsing, her name slowly forgotten by everyone except the small handful of instructors who still occasionally wondered, aloud, what had happened to the girl with her mother's ear. Julius had immediately called an old friend and former student of his own, Vivian Cross, now one of the most celebrated concert pianists in the country, who happened to be attending Reginald Vance's charity gala that very evening as a guest of honor. "There's a woman in that house tonight," Julius had told her just minutes before the hired pianist's flight was canceled. "If she's who I think she is, you'll know within 4 bars." Vivian had listened, intrigued but skeptical, tucking the information away as she made polite conversation through the early part of the evening. She had no idea, sipping champagne near the piano, that she was about to hear a housekeeper offer to play in front of a room that had just humiliated her, and that 4 bars would, indeed, be more than enough. The heavy silence in the room broke the moment Vivian Cross stood fully from her seat. "I'd like to hear her play," Vivian said, her voice carrying easily across the stunned gathering, calm but unmistakably firm. Reginald blinked, caught entirely off guard. "Vivian, I really don't think this is necessary." "I do," Vivian said simply, walking toward the piano with the quiet authority of someone whose opinion had never once been questioned in this world. She turned to Odessa, who stood frozen near the bench, and offered a small, encouraging nod. "Please, whenever you're ready." Odessa hesitated only a moment before sitting down at the bench, her mother's tuning fork pressing faintly against her palm inside her apron pocket, her fingers finding the keys with the same instinctive calm they had found decades earlier on a conservatory stage she'd never gotten to properly say goodbye to. She began to play. The first 4 bars moved through the room like something the guests had forgotten they were capable of feeling. It wasn't loud. It wasn't showy. It was precise, aching, deeply human, the kind of playing that came not from technical training alone, but from a lifetime of carrying grief and love in the same careful hands. Near the front row, Thelonious Reed set down his drink slowly, his eyes widening. Margaret Hollowell, the retired symphony conductor, rose from her seat entirely, her hand pressed lightly against her chest. And Vivian Cross, still standing beside the piano, closed her eyes and simply listened, tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. When Odessa finished, the room stayed silent for a long, suspended moment, the kind of silence that follows something too beautiful to immediately applaud. Then Vivian spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "I know that touch," she said, turning to face the stunned crowd. "I would know it anywhere." Julius Okafor trained a young woman with this exact phrasing almost 20 years ago, a prodigy who disappeared from the conservatory without a trace. She looked directly at Odessa. "You're her, aren't you? Odessa Marsh." The room turned, as one, toward Reginald Vance, whose face had gone the color of the marble floor beneath his feet. "That's impossible," Reginald said, though his voice had lost every ounce of its earlier confidence. "She's my housekeeper. She cleans this house." "She was cleaning this house," Walter said quietly, stepping forward from near the doorway, "because life gave her very few other choices after her family needed her. That's not the same as her not being extraordinary, sir." Julius Okafor's voice came through Vivian's phone on speaker, patched in moments earlier when the room's silence had made clear that something historic was unfolding. "I have every recording of Odessa's conservatory recitals still archived," he said. "I have her acceptance records, her scholarship documentation, every review the local papers wrote about her before she vanished. I've spent almost 2 decades wondering what happened to the most gifted student I ever trained." Margaret Hollowell, still standing near her seat, turned to Reginald with an expression of cold, deliberate disappointment. "You mocked this woman in front of a room full of people for touching a piano. She clearly understands better than anyone else here tonight, including whoever you paid to tune it." "I didn't know who she was," Reginald said quickly, grasping for footing that had already slipped away. "How was I supposed to know? She's dressed like someone doing an honest day's work." Thelonious Reed cut in, his voice low and even. "That's exactly the point, Mr. Vance. You didn't need to know who she used to be to treat her with basic respect. You simply chose not to." Reginald looked around the room, at his donors, several of whom had quietly begun stepping back from him, distancing themselves the way people do when proximity suddenly feels dangerous. At Walter, who would not look away this time. At Odessa herself, still seated at the piano bench, her composure finally beginning to crack, not from humiliation this time, but from something closer to disbelief. "It was a joke," Reginald tried. "A bad joke. I didn't mean—" "You meant every word," Vivian Cross said quietly. "We all heard you." The unraveling happened faster than anyone in that glittering room could have predicted. Within the hour, 3 of the evening's largest donors quietly informed Reginald's event coordinator that they would be withdrawing their pledge contributions to his charity foundation, unwilling to have their names publicly associated with a man who treated his staff the way Reginald had just been exposed treating Odessa. A reporter from the city's arts section, who had been covering the gala for a routine society piece, suddenly found herself sitting on the story of the year, quietly texting her editor from the back of the room. Reginald's face had gone fully pale by the time Julius Okafor's voice, still on speakerphone, calmly stated that he intended to personally verify Odessa's conservatory records publicly, ensuring there would be no question about who she truly was or what had been taken from her. "You can't do this to me," Reginald said, though even he seemed to hear how hollow the words sounded now, standing in the wreckage of an evening he had built entirely around his own image. "We're not doing anything to you," Margaret Hollowell said evenly. "You did this yourself, in front of every person in this room, hours before any of us even knew who she was." A few guests who had laughed along with Reginald's earlier joke now quietly gathered their coats, unwilling to be photographed anywhere near the collapse unfolding around him. Walter stepped forward and gently helped Odessa rise from the piano bench, her hands trembling now, not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming weight of finally being seen. "You should sit down, Mr. Vance," Walter said quietly, his 22 years of careful restraint finally giving way to something firmer. "I believe this evening no longer belongs to you." 8 months later, a small but elegant concert hall across town filled with quiet, reverent applause as Odessa Marsh walked onto a real stage for the first time in over 2 decades, her mother's tuning fork tucked, as always, into the pocket of a simple black dress that had nothing to prove to anyone. The story of that gala had spread far beyond the Vance Mansion's walls within days, and with the combined support of Vivian Cross, Thelonious Reed, Margaret Hollowell, and her long-lost mentor Julius Okafor, Odessa had spent the following months quietly rebuilding a career that tragedy and circumstance had once stolen from her, one careful rehearsal at a time. A new foundation, named the Eleanor Marsh Music Fund after Odessa's late mother, was established to provide scholarships and instrument repair training to young musicians from underserved communities, the very kind of overlooked talent that had once carried Odessa herself before life demanded she set aside. Walter Higgins, having finally spoken openly about years of quiet mistreatment inside the Vance household, left his position soon after and now works as an estate manager for a family, he says simply, who actually see the people who work for them. He attended Odessa's first concert from the front row, applauding longer than anyone else in the hall. Reginald Vance's charity foundation dissolved within the year, its major donors having permanently withdrawn support after the gala's public unraveling made national headlines. He remains, by most accounts, a wealthy man still, but a far quieter one, no longer welcomed at the kind of gatherings where his name once opened every door. At the end of her performance that evening, Odessa stood, bowed once, and held up her mother's small silver tuning fork toward the audience before tucking it gently back into her pocket. "This belonged to a woman who taught me that no instrument and no person should ever be dismissed just because someone else refuses to listen closely enough," she said. "Tonight, I finally got to prove her right." Have you ever seen someone's talent or worth overlooked simply because of the job they were doing? What would you have done in that room? Drop your answer in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe for more real stories about dignity, justice, and the quiet power of people who are underestimated.